Hi, welcome to another edition of North Shore Journal. I'm your host, Walt Kosmowski, and I have a very special guest with me today, good friend John Tierney. John?
Walt, nice to see you again.
Welcome, welcome.
Thanks.
And John is now the Executive Director of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Did I get that right?
You got it right.
Right. And I'm sure that John is no stranger to the viewers out there because John was 9 terms, did you have?
9 terms, right.
9-term congressman from the 6th Massachusetts District. And during that time, you were with the House Intelligence Committee and the chair of the National Security and Foreign Affairs Committee.
The subcommittee on oversight, right?
Right. And of course, we had a lot of interviews here at BevCam over the years with John as well. So welcome. It's good to have you in the studio.
Yeah, nice to be back.
Yeah. So as a first order of business, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Center for Arms Control and tell us a little bit about yourself and what your mission is, John.
All right. Well, I'm the executive director of both the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation and the Council for a Livable World. So the Council for a Livable World actually was an organization started by Leo Szilard. Leo Szilard was a physicist out of Budapest by way of Germany who got out when he saw Hitler coming. Advised a lot of others to do the same. Unfortunately, not all of them took the advice. But when he came to the United States and was traveling back and forth, he realized that the Germans were looking toward getting a nuclear bomb. And so he wanted to advise Roosevelt, but didn't have a very good relationship, or any relationship really, with Roosevelt. So he convinced Einstein to join him in a letter and have Einstein deliver the letter to Roosevelt warning him. And from that, they got the Manhattan Project. Einstein read Roosevelt read the letter, appreciated what was being told to him, and like that, started the project. Well, Szilard and others all participated in the project, except, of course, Einstein was precluded for security issues on that, oddly enough.
Interesting, huh?
Yeah, very odd, very odd. But when the bomb was being developed, they started to realize devastating, catastrophic effects it could have. Szilard then got about hundreds of physicists to sign a letter to Truman at the time, advising him not to use it in Japan. Of course, whether that letter ever got to him or not is not known, but of course he went on and used it. From that point on, Szilard and a lot of scientists, the Federation of American Scientists and other groups that Szilard actually started, were trying to either get international control over that technology or get it eliminated or put back in the box, so to speak. This went on without a great deal of success. In the 1960s, when there was the Cuban Missile Affair,
crisis,
that's when Szilard famously decided that maybe just knowledge wasn't enough, or she said the sweet sound of reason isn't enough, that maybe we have to get political about this and combine that knowledge with politics. He started the Council for a Livable World, which then would support candidates who had a sensible foreign policy position in nuclear position on issues, help them raise money, help them get elected, help advise them on the issues, and then lobby them when they got elected. In the 1980s, they had the offshoot of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, which was the educational and analytical side of things on that. So the two organizations have been moving on those paths since then.
Yeah, and we're still, that question that was posed to Truman, we're still debating that to this day, and that's the reason for your organization.
Well, right. I mean, there's all sorts of issues involved in this thing, from the small to the large, and not the least of which is, how do you contain what you've now created? And what dangers does it present, even if it isn't used by a maniacal leader somewhere and starts firing off missiles? What about accident, mistake, miscalculation, all of which we've shown incidents of?
Trying to get the genie back in the bottle, as it were, right? Now, you must have, let me ask your thoughts on ICAN being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And for our viewers, ICAN is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and they were just awarded about 2 or 3 weeks ago the Nobel Peace Prize. That must make you feel good that a sister organization got that recognition.
Right. Well, ICAN's a huge umbrella organization. Over 400 different entities are members of that ICAN. But it's a message sent out by the Nobel Committee, which is what they do very often with these prizes. And the message is the world is finally, starting to refocus on an issue that had a lot of attention in the late 70s and 80s into the 90s. In that the world has to get a sense of urgency about it once again. And that's been important. And if you remember in 1985, they gave the award to the precursor to the Physicians for Social Responsibility, in acknowledgement of all the organizational work that they did in the 1970s and 80s that led to Reagan actually starting down the path of realizing, these nuclear things are not what he thought they were, and that we have to come to some agreement with the Russians on that. So this has come full cycle now, where people say, this did not end with the Cold War ending, that we have a lot of issues still out there, that we have 9 countries with nuclear weapons right now, that and all but one of them has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means they're supposed to keep reducing things, but there hasn't been a reduction since 2010. So as you know, in the UN, countries got together and passed a treaty making illegal the possession of nuclear weapons recently. Of course, the 9 countries that have them, and a lot of their allies who are under their umbrella, didn't sign it, but about 130 countries did. And it's a statement, powerful statement from countries that you told us not to have nuclear weapons, and the other quid pro quo for that was you were supposed to keep reducing yours. And you haven't done it with any sense of urgency, and now we have all this heightened attention with Kim in North Korea and Trump in the United States and everybody, that we're getting back to a situation like we were in the 80s, and we don't want that. Well,
now that you brought it up, I was going to ask that, my very next question. So what are the chances that their nuclear weapons will be used in the Korean Peninsula? How do you think this whole situation is going to play out?
Well, you don't know how it's going to play out, and that's part of the problem. In foreign affairs, uncertainty is not a very good thing. It's a little bit like business. People always go around saying there's uncertainty in business is no good. They have to know what the regulatory scheme is and what the tax situation is. Well, in international relations, people have to know where the power lies and where the restraint is going to be and how people are going to treat one another, so that people can have a sense of security on that. What's destabilizing now is the rhetoric coming from both Kim and from Trump, of course, and the idea that we don't necessarily think that Trump, hopefully not, and certainly Kim, hopefully not, are going to start firing off missiles. But the other thing is, what happens about miscalculation and mistake? What happens if, say, President Trump says something or does some act that he doesn't realize is going to set off a counter-reaction by Kim? And by counter-reaction, I mean, I think Kim, by accounts of all experts that I talk to on this, is not considered to be insane. He's not considered to be crazy. He's very calculating what he's done in terms of developing a weapon. He understands that the United States has talked for a long time, since the 1950s, about taking out his regime. His grandfathers and his fathers and his. And he understands that. And then he looks at Libya, and he looks at Iraq, who got rid of their weapons and had the regimes taken out. And he's made the calculated decision that, despite the economic situation in their country, he's got to make the investment on having nuclear weapons. There's nobody saying that he's not a little debased, and certainly a problem on that, but he's not so insane that he's going to fire off unprovoked a missile at the United States or anybody else, because it would basically end not just his regime, but his country.
Absolutely.
But the question then becomes, what happens if he thinks his regime is under change? What happens if somebody takes it too far in what they say or what they do in exercises out in that area, whatever? Does he react?
Right. And I think a lot of people don't realize, I mean, the United States press is always saying, well, North Korea is this destabilizing influence and they're doing these tests and everything, but they don't realize that we have for decades done war games every year. We have, what, close to 40,000 troops stationed there. We have mock invasions every single year right on their doorstep. And if you thought, what if North Korea had mock invasions south of Southern California, in the Baja every year? Well, there's
the balance that the United States tries to strike between assuring our allies and friends that we will come to their aid if somebody starts attacking them, sort of an interest of making sure that they don't go out and get their own nuclear weapons, and then not taking an overstep that puts somebody else in fear that you're going after them. And sometimes it's a difficult line to keep, but there's also ways that could be used to start conversations with people, too. And if you just redirected the focus or the direction of these exercises, that might send a message that, well, you're willing to be a little less aggressive if they be a little less aggressive. And there are all sorts of nuances that could be put into place. We're not very good at nuance under this administration, unfortunately. So.
Now, you mentioned before, about some of the less than sober, if I can use that word, international leaders. If a president, what if President Trump wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning and in a rage and he wants to press the button? Is there some sort of a filter in place that would preclude just something like that from happening?
Well, our argument, myself and our organization's argument, is the Constitution is what precludes him from firing off a nuclear charge that's not provoked or when we're not in imminent danger. That clearly the only body that can commit war is the legislature, and certainly dropping a nuclear bomb on somebody is an act of war, no matter how you define it. The problem then becomes that some presidents don't believe that that's a limitation on them. They believe that since they're the executive, the commander-in-chief, they're going to be able to take action. They might define imminent threat differently than somebody else. But once a decision is made, even if it was a retaliatory decision, they thought they were under imminent threat or somebody was coming at us, the president is the only one, without any restrictions, basically, that can say, we're firing. Go to his so-called football and get the codes and decide what's going to be fired where. And then it's about 30 minutes.
Well, now you say that only Congress can declare war, but here we have the scenario where the president can press that button. And why are we having, I think the Democrats now, I don't know if there's any Republicans involved, that's immaterial, are pressing for legislation that would, in essence, prop up the Constitution, say you can't declare war unless, you know, we approve it. And
it's a reinforcement. I mean, it's sort of the congressional power has eroded, and for Congress's own fault. They've sort of let it slide all the way back to the Vietnam War era. And, you know, the War Powers Act, it was put in there that a president can take action if we're under threat for up to 60 days, and then, you know, has to report to Congress, and Congress can decide whether to continue or not. That's one erosion on that power. Then presidents have sort of taken it further by committing us in different areas. But ever since they had the authorization for the use of military force back in Afghanistan, allowing it to go into Afghanistan, presidents since then of both parties have sort of stretched that out. You know, the only limitations on that were that, you know, it weren't as to time, you know, like that. It was to Al-Qaeda or anybody associated with Al-Qaeda's activities could be pursued. And so now that definition gets, does that cover ISIS? Does it cover the Taliban? Does it cover others? But presidents have used that, and I think abused it on that. Most people that voted to go into Afghanistan, I believe, and I was there and voted for it. I first tried to narrow the scope of that AUMF on that and was unsuccessful on that, but I thought that it should have been limited in time and geography on that, and it wasn't. It lost that motion. But then the idea was that we were going to go in and get Osama bin Laden, and that was it. And then we were going to get out. Because you remember, right, at the time George Bush was all about not nation building on that. Unfortunately, they went in. He was allowed to escape, you know, into Pakistan, and most people believe. And then the President Bush decided he was going to go after Iraq. So you take what limited, you know, special forces we had at the time, and what limited predators, drones we had at the time, and move them up in that direction. And of course, we all know the story of Osama bin Laden and the Taliban and everybody else starting to cause furor back in, sort of lost control of Afghanistan again, and had the problem in Iraq. So that, you know, these things sort of get out of control on that. But now you have that same authorization for the use of military force being used all over the place. And Jimmy McGovern, my colleague from Worcester area, he's an excellent congressman on that, has always been good on these issues. He recently just got a report released from the Congressional Research Service. By their account, without looking at the classified information, which they didn't have access to, there's 129 countries where the United States has troops. Some number of troops. In fact, his report specifies how many in each country. But then you get to a little catch-all phrase down the bottom. It says 26,000 members unknown. As if unknown where they are. Well, we know where they are, but they're classified on that, so they're spread someplace else, or someplace in this country. And
I want to get to that in a little bit. I do want to ask you. We talked about Korea, the Iran nuclear deal. That's been in the press, public eye recently. It looks like only the United States and Israel think that it's a bad idea. All the rest of the world thinks it's good. What's your take on the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I would say that it is a good deal. You know, it did what it set out to do. And there's only a limited number of people in the United States that think it's not a good deal. The majority of people in the United States, far and away, in all the polling that I've seen, think that it should be preserved. And, you know, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, the allies that we're involved with, all the signatories to the agreement, all believe that that Iran is living up to its obligations under the agreement. It does put off for many years any possibility of Iran getting a nuclear program. And that was the goal.
Yeah.
It wasn't something we set out that we thought in one agreement we could end all of their involvement in terrorism, that we could end all of their destabilization in the Middle East, that we could do all of those things. That was never something anybody thought was feasible in an agreement.
Yeah.
The idea was to do something about their nuclear power. And as most of the former intelligence and military people in Israel say, would much rather be dealing with a non-nuclear Iran than with a nuclear Iran.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, just as we talked about with the nuclear codes, can the president just unilaterally, because it's not a two-person, two-side deal, because on the United States side, you got Russia and China and several other countries. I think there are 5 or 6 on the other side. So can the president just unilaterally pull us out of that deal without consulting Congress?
Well, because it's not a treaty, it's an agreement. You know, there's a process through which he could withdraw from that agreement. But the others show that they have no intention of doing that. So they'd like to keep the agreement going even if the United States were to withdraw or to not participate anymore. The problem with that is the credibility of the United States in any foreign situation after that is shot.
Yeah.
It's pretty well injured now, just from the rhetoric and the talk that he's had and the motion that he's going around on. If you make a deal, and a deal's a deal, then we want it. What would we do now if Iran decided that, you know, hey, we're just going to start our program up again? Well, we'd think that was a violation, and we'd be pretty upset. And so here's the United States saying, well, we're just, you know, not going to comply with our end of the deal because we decided that we wish we had stayed in and negotiated a better deal. There is no better deal that could be negotiated at that table at that time.
Yeah.
You know, there are other deals. You might want to go back to the table and talk about the missile program. You might want to talk about other, you know, adventures of Iran or something like that, but that's a different discussion for a different situation. Yeah.
Now, on your website, there are some articles, great articles. There are so many. I started to read some. It just go on and on. It's just full of good information and data.
Thank you.
There was an article that said that the United States is planning to spend up to $1 trillion in the next 30 years on revamping our nuclear arsenal. And they also said that it would be costing us, in and above that, just to maintain the arsenal on a daily, yearly basis, that we would be spending $18 billion a year between 2021 and 2035. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to have our control room put up the 2017 budget slide as a, this was actually the last budget that the Obama administration was involved in, and I'd like to just talk about if you talk about 1 trillion, that whole circle there is 1.15 trillion, which includes everything.
But that's a single year.
Yeah, that's a single year. Yeah. And then if you talk about 18 billion per year through those 14 or 15 years, and if you look at some of those figures. Food and agriculture, 12, and transportation, 24, science, 30, and you compare that to 18 billion every year, you're shortchanging the rest of the country. I mean, you're shortchanging the needs of our people and growing our economy and developing science and so forth. What's your?
I mean, this is a comment that goes all the way back to Eisenhower, who understood that, right?
Yeah.
Who said that you got to watch out for the military-industrial complex because they'll just eat up all of the resources at the expense of education and health and your infrastructure and all of that. Everybody believes there should be security, all right? And everybody believes that if you have a weapon, you know, like if you're one of those people that believes that you need some nuclear power for deterrence to stop other people from using theirs against you, that has to be at least in condition that is safe, and if it were called upon, has to be something that will function. So that's the concept most people have of modernization, is you just make sure that things that you have work. And in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, our obligation would then be to try to have less and less of those in agreement with the other countries that hold it and try to get it to a point eventually of zero. This modernization program that's being proposed looks to many people, and I'm one of those people, that it may be an excuse for proliferation, maybe an excuse for new types of weapons, new types of delivery systems, and new types of bombs or whatever, which in essence draws a really close distinction. Are you violating any of the existing agreements? And are you not going for non-proliferation as opposed to proliferation? Are you not being destabilizing by doing that? And so to the extent that the money is being put into all these new systems, it's unnecessary, it's destabilizing, And it does, take a lot of opportunity cost away from doing what even our command structure in the military says is essential, that you have to have a strong economy.
That's
is
right.
probably fundamental to your defense. Everybody seems to miss that point. These are your generals and admirals and others telling you, you need to have a strong economy at home. You need that infrastructure. You need a good education system. You need healthy people in order for us to ever be secure. So that's the argument on that thing. And it's now 1.6 trillion was the latest thing over 30 years. If they go on the plan, and the interesting part of that is even the military and most people in the Obama administration started to get it. The idea that, if all of this stuff is going to be built in the 2020s and 2030s, then it's going to come in direct conflict with all of the conventional weapons that are also supposed to be upgraded during that period of time. And that confluence of spending is going to drive the things right through the roof, and you'll have even more cuts in all of your domestic programs at the expense of building up this military that is unnecessary. You look at the number of nuclear weapons that we have in this country, and yet you look at the strategic command and other experts that will say you can have 300 would serve as a deterrence of any situation that you can imagine.
Of course.
We've got thousands.
You don't need 7,000.
Exactly.
Now what's happened to the anti-war movement? It was so robust when I was in college and afterwards. It was so robust during the Vietnam War. It seems to be no anti-war movement these days.
Well, there is one out there, but I tell you, you look young. Well, but if you say that, but most people that were active in when you were in college or in the 80s and everything like that are older now. And they're still very much engaged in this. They're good supporters of organizations like ours. And they're incensed about it. They're urgent about it. There's so many conflicting things. We're trying to find this answer ourselves. Why aren't other generations as urgently involved in this issue as they were? And you hit, well, they've got Black Lives Matter, inequality, women's issues, human rights issues, environmental issues, climate change, and everybody has their thing. And then what we're hearing from a lot of people is, well, we understand, the dangers of nuclear weapons and all of that, but we don't think there's anything we can do about it. And that sort of like shies a lot of people away from that. So we've been talking two things. One is people that understand the nuclear issue and the fact that we have way too many of them and that they have to be reduced. Nobody believes we're going to get rid of them this year, next year, or probably in my lifetime or yours. But the idea was to get on that trajectory and start decreasing them and decreasing the danger and the insecurity that goes along with it on that path. People that understand that have to also be involved in other issues. Show that they care about other things that people do, and in return, I think they'll care about that issue, and then show them there's something they can do. You can do something. For instance, there's a lot of talk all of a sudden, children through some people like Mac Thornberry, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, mentioned the other day, well, maybe we have to start testing again. Really? I mean, with all the dangers and everything like that, well, that should get environmentalists concerned. That should get people in the human rights area and justice area and all those issues concerned, because all of our experts tell us you don't need to test. The computer programming that we have now, a way of determining whether or not a system works, is better than if we test it.
Than if we actually tested it,
So what we want people to do is, go to Mac Thornberry's district in his town hall meeting and say to him, so you want testing in your district? And obviously he's going to say no. Because nobody wants it in their backyard.
Of course.
They want to find it in somebody else's. And we start a little campaign. That's something you can do. You can take it to your member of Congress, your senator, or your member, and put them on the spot. Where is it exactly you think you want to do this unnecessary testing? Because we can show you examples of what happened in Utah and out in Nevada and out that area when people are tested.
Well, in the South Pacific, you have some of those islanders that have permanently been, dispossessed of their land. Now, are we, John? Are we a violent nation? Are we I mean, you look at our movies, our video games, our sports. I mean, have we become desensitized by violence, where we just let it pass? Where I see things now on television that when I was a kid, you never even dreamed that you'd see.
Well, I think the media, certainly has brought it home to people where you can see more graphically we used to use our imagination when you were growing up and things. Now you see it graphically on there. You see the results of it. I suspect that that's somewhat desensitizing. If you can see the danger and never anybody feels any pain, just see it on there and people are in a problem. But in terms of the nuclear situation, I think people still think that a nuclear bomb goes off is going to be like Hiroshima or Nagasaki, which were devastatingly, like when you think about it.
Thousands of times.
But today's bombs are much larger than that, would cause much more devastating damage, catastrophic damage on that. And so that has to be appreciated by people, not in the sense that we want to scare them, We want to alarm them to the point of doing something urgent about it, getting on their policymakers to start thinking about this, getting back to the notion that it was all about the freeze in the 1980s. Well, now it ought to be about, like the freeze and not having this proliferation under the guise of modernization, and the idea, when are you going to get back to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and do what you were obligated to do, which is negotiate with the other countries that have these bombs and try to reduce that situation, not come up with new kinds or more powerful kinds or different ways to deliver it.
Yeah. Now, throughout history, there's been this philosophical conundrum or discussion. Does might make right? And it seems, is it inevitable throughout history where you get two or three powers that inevitably come to war, and especially in today's world where the competition for ever dwindling resources, is that inevitable, or can we?
Well, I like to think it's not inevitable. I like to think that that's what the United States was about, the fact that it actually wasn't inevitable, that you could have a power, then hopefully other powers follow suit to start looking at, what is going to be best for all of humanity. How do we put our resources together and, not have conflicts between each other, find a way to get along, but also put the incredible resources of intelligence and technologies that we keep evolving to better use for everybody. And on the climate change area, we do some of that.
Yeah.
We find some common ground with China, and at least until this administration we did, and other countries, and say, how do we put that to use and come up with a way that's fair, and compensate those that are going to be injured by certain movements, because we understand that they weren't in the right place at the right time for a lot of development, and talk along those lines. And yet we always sort of put it into, like, oh boy, we're competing with this person, and they're going to take it or we're going to take it. Yes, if you allow that environment to rise, then it's going to be that kind of a competitive thing. There's got to be some world leaders out there that we can get to, that will start looking at this area. So we understand the competitive nature on this thing, but we've got to keep it, in a flow that we can be competitive, we can be cautious, we can make sure we're secure, but let's also find some ideas to find some common ground, focus on that, build some trust, and start moving to some solutions.
Yeah. But now, in the present administration, and I have a slide we'll put up in a bit, diplomacy, the State Department, we're taking money away from diplomacy. It's like shoot first and ask questions later, bluster, and no negotiations. What does that tell the public? And the public doesn't seem to be saying, no, that's not the way. And what does Congress do about that kind of a mindset?
Well, for one thing, Congress cannot cut the budget of the State Department to the extent that is being requested. The problem then is you get an executive that might not spend the money you give them.
Yeah.
That's not proper, and it's not lawful. It takes a lot to unravel that and chase that down. I think they've got to push back and make clear through hearings, through statements that they make, through the votes that they take, that the State Department plays an incredible role.
Yeah.
And I'll give you one good example. Everybody talks about North Korea right now. What are we going to do to resolve that situation? Except for those people who may think that a military solution is possible, and most people with any reason don't think that's possible at all. It comes down to trying to find a way to get to the table with leverage.
Yeah.
Well, the leverage the United States would have was sanctions.
Yeah.
And, tightening up the sanctions and having them enforced on that basis. Well, who's going to do that? It's going to be your diplomats.
Yeah.
If you're cutting away your diplomats and you don't have, we don't have an ambassador in South Korea right now.
That's right.
I mean, how disgusting is that?
Yeah.
I mean, there's the hot point of the world right now,
I know.
and you don't have an ambassador out there. You also don't have a lot of intermediate level people in those areas of the State Department that deal with nuclear policy. And even in the Department of Energy, the same on this. So, and you went from having an Ernie Moniz as the Secretary of Energy, who was in fact a physicist and a knowledgeable guy, a scientist on that, and to Rick Perry, who, maybe people may think is a great guy and all of that, but he by his own admission, is not that sort of a technical hand. When is he going to appoint people in his administration that technical aspect that he needs?
Well, Perry wanted to get rid of the department that he was made secretary.
Well, he admitted later, upon appointment, he admitted he didn't know that his department deals 60% of what he does is deals with nuclear energy, and he didn't know it. And that's frightening when you think about it.
Well, and you mentioned the diplomacy. When you see Nikki Haley, our ambassador to the UN, say one thing, and our Secretary of State say something else, and Mattis, it's so confusing, not only for the average citizen, but for countries around the world. You talked about how if we don't keep up to our word in agreements, that's going to affect our credibility. Well, here we have different parts of the administration and countries saying different things. That does the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's some that think that this is by design, that this administration thinks that it's clever to keep everybody guessing. In that sense, they'll always have an ability to negotiate better on whatever it is they're talking about. Most people with a knowledge of foreign policy will think that's not a good idea, because people want to know what they're talking about, know the parameters of any discussion, and be able to more reasonably put things on the table that can be negotiated one way or the other. I don't know how these people stay in this administration the way they're undermined. Tillerson, Secretary Tillerson, is repeatedly undermined. He seems to be willing to go along with it. He's sat quietly while they were emaciating his department, cutting his budget on that. Says very well. He did say he did have a name for the president, I guess, at one point in time, but he sort of tried to rebalance that act without saying that he hadn't said it. But it's got to be not just frustrating, but I would think a little bit demeaning and embarrassing to folks. You know, to not be able to go out there and say it. The idea is you have these people in place so that they can be the voice of the administration, not so that the president come out later and say, well, don't listen to that guy. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. Why have them? You know, if they can't go around the world and can't deal with other people, the president can't deal with every other country all at once. That's why you have these departments and assistants on that. But if you're going to undermine everything they do, then you might as well be on your own. Now,
you've heard of the doomsday clock, of course, and for our viewers who may not be familiar, this is something that I think scientists, about the time we were talking about the development of nuclear weapons, around that time after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped. And it's a clock that goes down to midnight, if you will, and it shows how close we are to some kind of global catastrophe that would mean the end of civilization as we know it. And I think you were talking about some of the things that happen in history where the clock has gained time and then lost time. And I think in the last couple of years, we're down to, what, 2 or 3 minutes on the clock.
It got moved, unfortunately, a little closer to midnight with some of the rhetoric that's been going on, and instead of an attempt to resolve issues, to heighten the rhetoric on that. But, you know, it's not just the situation of, you know, two countries going to war like Russia and the United States. Back when that was being contemplated in the 80s, Carl Sagan, who was a member of our board, Council for a Livable World board for about 16 or 18 years at the time, he talked about a nuclear winter, about if the United States and Russia really went to war, how it would not just affect those two countries, but because you'd be getting cities, and the cities would be sending up the smoke and soot and ash and like that, it would block out layers of the atmosphere and cause a nuclear winter. You wouldn't be able to grow anything for a while. That's been refined lately by the Physicians for Social Responsibility and the work that they've had done with scientists and people looking at this, that if India and Pakistan went at it, and each sent 100 missiles toward the other on that, that could create enough of a nuclear winter that anything above the equator wouldn't grow for 10 years.
Wow.
So these are the things, you know, we're not trying to scare people, but get your attention on this. This is important because while India's, as best we know, is fairly secure, there's no questions about the security of the system in Pakistan. You know, on that. And so, you know, we have to talk about these issues. These are things we should be addressing, not heightening tensions in North Korea, but trying to get around the world and saying, look, there are still 9 countries that have these things. How do we start bringing these numbers down so that there isn't, you know, a situation where you're worried about having a mistake or a miscalculation on that? There have been so many incidents. I'm not a book review, but if you haven't read Command and Control, it talks about, you know, just one incident that happened, you know, in Arkansas, you know, when Bill Clinton was governor out there or whatever, that almost set off a catastrophe that would have been monumental. On that, a guy dropped the wrench down one of the silos, and it was as simple as that. The thing almost set everything off. You know, so there was an incident where, you know, the Russians misread a satellite that was being sent off over up in the area of Norway and Iceland, in that area, reflections of the sun. They misread it as an attack going into Russia, and we're very close to firing off, except for one lieutenant down the chain refused to push the button. And before they found that was a mistake. And Bill Perry, who I had the good fortune of being with the other day, was Secretary of State, as you know, during the Jimmy Carter years or whatever. But, you know, he talks about the incidents of getting a call in the middle of the night saying, it was the Secretary, we've got a situation here where our computers show 200 missiles coming in from Russia on that. And before he had a chance to even say anything, the guy says, but we think it's an error. You know, and he's, you know, on that. But, and he said, why are they calling me? Well, they were calling him because they wanted to fix the equipment. You know, he had nothing to do with the chain of it. At that time, he was actually an undersecretary. But he said, but, you know, if they hadn't thought that it was an error, what was next? Next was a call to the president. The president make a decision all within 30 minutes. Well,
you were saying about you don't want to scare people, but it is scary because if you look at is a nuclear war winnable? Because if let's say you get your nukes over there first, and let's say you don't even get nuked in return, but all of that fallout, everything that's in the atmosphere, instead of being immolated in one split second, you die a slow, agonizing death over years and years. Is that what do you want to be the winner of a nuclear war?
So quote Ronald Reagan, right? Yeah, a nuclear war cannot be won, and a nuclear war should never be fought.
Well,
and this is what sort of I find amazing. This shouldn't be a partisan issue, and it hadn't been for years and years and years. And now it seems to be getting that way, which is disturbing. Ronald Reagan turned out to be a very strong advocate for arms control on that basis because he came to complete evolution. Once he saw the havoc and the catastrophic results that could happen from it, he started to say, well, we've got to do something about it. The only thing that stopped it from being even a larger agreement during the years that he was president was that he would not give up the missile defense program. This notion that he had that we could have a shield on that. If he could have negotiated that away, he would have got huge reductions. In fact, the Russians wanted an elimination of the nuclear on that, and that president wouldn't give up. And he had the best intentions, I think. He really thought perhaps that you could have this shield. But every physicist that I know has been very clear about it. You will never have a successful shield that you can rely upon. You might be able to get an occasional shooting down of a missile or a couple missiles or whatever, but you'll never have a system that's reliable to the point that you can base a military strategy on it.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that we have troops in 126.
I think it was 129 that Jimmy's report showed.
Okay, not very many that we don't have troops at the point. Now you're familiar with Stephen Kinzer, the writer. He's a Boston writer. There was an article in yesterday's Boston Globe by Stephen, and it highlighted on the war in Yemen and what the United States' role was. But the very first paragraph said that, if I can paraphrase, that our adventurism and posting, having these troops everywhere, it does more to destabilize us. We have whole civilizations, whole countries, whole religions that want to get even with us, so that instead of spending, like we said before, spending the money in our backyard and improving our roads and bridges and hospitals and medical care and everything else, it seemed like it's a deliberate, it's like, why would you do this?
Or spend your money on intelligent foreign aid, foreign assistance, which will preclude the situation of war later on if you do it wisely enough.
And before you, I just want to intersect and have you combine your answer with this. We have thousands of troops now in Africa, which a lot of people don't even know about. Now, when China goes over there, they send over engineers and architects and contractors. They build roads and bridges and hospitals. When we go over there, we go with troops and with weapons. There's the difference in the philosophy.
When I was still in Congress and on the Oversight Committee, I held hearings on AFRICOR. When we caught wind that they were forming this group called AFRICOR, and we called in the people involved on it at the time, and their story was, well, we're really going to send in people from the Agricultural Department and Commerce and all these other areas. We want to go in and help these countries. But you're sending in only military people. And their answer was, well, we can't get people from the other departments that want to give up a year of their life or 2 years of their life to go over and do that, because they, in most cases, said they couldn't bring their families with them, or whatever concocted reason. But the fact was they were sending people in uniform to not just help stand up the police department or the Coast Guard of another country, whatever, but ostensibly to do all of the assistance work. And African countries at the time were saying, we don't want that. We don't want your military projection here. And every country except for Liberia had turned down any notion of having even a small base in Africa on that period. That's the reaction people get of, here they come the Americans again. As Stephen Kinzer would say, this colonial power. And Kinzer does great writing about the history of the United States. He's got several books out there on that and our interventions and what they've wrought on that. But and here we are again. And Congress is starting to wake up on this issue. I hope that they become fully alert. Ask the question of why are we in each one of those countries and what is it that we're supposed to be doing? And if we pick those people out of that country, what would be the bad effect of that? I mean, I'm sure countries can survive without the presence of the United States. We don't have to be controlling every single thing. And we could use our resources for our own country and to help countries. We truly want to help countries. There are a lot of things we could do that would help their economies and help their health in their education systems or whatever, and get a lot more bang for our buck in terms of building future friends.
Precisely. Now, are we, John, are we becoming a totalitarian state? Are we becoming more of a fascist, authoritarian state here?
Well, there was a lot of debate about that, months ago when this administration first got in place. I think some of it is tempered down because it looks like, there is some restraint on this administration at some points in time from some of the people that are there, and Congress seems to be waking up on that. No, I don't think we are there. I think there's always the fear that you could get there if things got unraveled and kept going in that direction. And so that's why Congress is so important, and the people that are appointed to administrations are important, and the public is important to push back and make sure these things don't happen, and why public activism is important. I talked to a group of students out at the University of Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago. Great young people and like that. Some were in the med school, some were in the regular school. And their feeling was like, well, we just don't think we can accomplish anything. And I said, well, how do you say that? I said, well, we don't think anything that's being done by the older generations is getting anything done. I said, well, what about the health care bill? I said, you beat the health care bill by 1 vote. I said, and that was by going out to all the town meetings, to making it known that this was not something that was acceptable, that you were going to take a destruction of the Health Care, Affordable Care Act on those terms that they were presenting. And you went out to town hall meetings, you protested, you took to the streets, you wrote letters, you used social media, you did all of those things, and you won by 1 vote. I says, what if you hadn't done all of those things? What if you hadn't? So the idea is, yeah, it's painful and it's slow and it takes a lot of work, but that's democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the reason I asked you that question as well, you can go on the internet and find, I found this article about the 13 signs of potential fascism. And if you look at one of them, of course, was an unbridled nationalism, a praising of the military, and support for the corporate state, vilifying subgroups and blaming things on other religions or other subgroups and so forth, and more militarism. And as I went through those 13, and I wanted to bring in an article, and I left it on my desk, unfortunately, it seemed like you could tick off every one of those things. I don't know, your comment on that?
This is not a monolithic nation. So while there may be some in this country that are showing those tendencies, something like that, the majority of Americans are not. And I think that's what saves your democracy in the end, is if that majority makes itself heard and makes sure that that minority doesn't carry the sway. So you have to be active, and you have to be conscious of what's going on, and you have to push back on that, because, as I say, there are tendencies out there, and a lot of denial about them, but the facts are facts. Well, at least they used to be, but on that. But we should be concerned about that. I don't think we should, we should say that it's here or that we're fascist or anything of that nature like that. But I think that we should say there are tendencies among some, who are out there and are very active on that, and that's why the rest of us, if we really believe in our democracy, then we've got to stand up and do something.
Wouldn't it be great, we play the Star Spangled Banner at all of our sporting events and before city council meetings and so forth, and yet in a lot of events there's the military projection after that, the planes go by and all that stuff. Wouldn't it be great that instead of that we could just turn to each other and say, I wish you peace, just like something you do in church, and say, I wish you peace, I wish you peace. It's just if the whole mindset could be
well, the
changed.
mindset needs a real adjustment. I mean, this idea that if you believe in peace, you're a wimp, it seems to be emanating out there. Anybody that talks about peace, like, what about a Mandela? What about a Gandhi? What about people who really believed in peace? To me, they're the heroes. They're the strong people on this. But it's somewhat easy to be a bully because nobody's calling you on it sometimes. Well, it would be nice to call out the bullies and start to come back with the facts and basically start talking about this. We should be talking about peace. We should be talking about peace and justice. That's what will bring you security. And so we don't want to, we won't give up on the word security. We understand the notion that we have to be a secure nation and we have to have what it takes to be secure. But as you said, we're projecting to 129 or more countries and like that. Is that what you need for security? Or do you need to be able to protect yourself if somebody's trying to project into you or your interest? And while we may argue that we're protecting our interests out there, I think we should really question that deeply and say in those areas where it's not necessary, get out. On that part and everything like that, and confine it, and then put your attention to what are we going to do for security, for peace, and for justice, and build on that, and make sure that we have leaders standing up to say that, so they don't get away with saying, "Oh, you're weak on defense." It's been a problem for the Democrats for years, right? That, you know, like, oh, you know, we don't want to seem weak on defense because they'll take that in a 30-second ad and they will kill you with it.
Yeah.
It's very devastating and very tough. But if we get enough leaders standing up and projecting, you know, that the strength is in, you know, talking about peace and meaning it, showing other countries that we're not about always projecting military strength and ruling over them and controlling their decisions for their country. We're about peace, we're about justice, and we're about our own security, which by virtue of it will make the world more secure. But we want to do things that project a positive influence that move everybody along, help them all be more prosperous. You know, we got to get back to those days. That's what this country used to be.
Right.
Not just that we were some hammer going around pounding every nail.
That's right.
You know, on that. And unfortunately, that's the kind of leadership they have at the moment that thinks that, you know, we just have to go up and beat our chest and yell and scream. But bullies end up in trouble a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and a lot of times they deserve it. So we better be careful.
Yeah. Well, John, I can't think of a better way to end this discussion. A very, very, very well put statement. And my guest today has been John Tierney. John, thank you for being on. John is the Executive Director of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. And John, I know you're a very, very busy man, and I have to personally thank you for stopping by the BevCam studio today for this interview. I really appreciate it.
Well, it was good to see you again, Walt. You do a great show, and I really appreciate that you stay at it.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. And I'd like to remind everybody that you have been watching North Shore Journal. I'm your host, Walt Kosmowski. We'll see you next time.